They expected fireworks. That's the part that always haunts them later. They thought betrayal would erupt in flames, in a storm of rage, in threats flung like knives across a battlefield. They were prepared for tears, for pleading, for emotional debris scattered in your wake. But instead, you gave them stillness. You gave them silence. And that, more than any retaliation, is what haunts their memory like a ghost that never leaves. You didn't give them closure. You didn't give them performance. You gave them the one thing they couldn't process: peace. The kind of peace that doesn't beg for validation. The kind that simply withdraws, slow and surgical. You stayed calm, and in doing so, you rewrote the entire narrative. Because they didn't see the damage right away. But they would. Oh, they would. Too late to fix it. Too late to matter. Your calm was not surrender. It was strategy. A weapon carved from restraint. Because fury is expected. And what is expected is easily dismissed. When you scream, they tune you out. When you chase, they run faster. But when you go still, when you fold your energy into yourself and vanish from their games, they lose their script. They stumble through their rehearsed apologies, finding no stage to perform on. And the silence? That's where the truth settles. They didn't break you. They revealed themselves. And in that moment of revelation, you made your decision. Not loudly, not with vengeance, but with a chilling clarity that would echo in their mind every time they reached for someone else who would never be you. They'll claim they didn't mean it, that you misunderstood, that they were going through something. But they weren't confused when they lied. They weren't healing when they betrayed. They weren't lost when they ignored your efforts. The mistake wasn't a misstep. It was a choice. And your calm is the mirror that reflects that truth back at them. Because now, there's no excuse. No chaos to hide in. No argument to distract from the fact that they had something rare and killed it out of carelessness. You're not gone because of one moment. You're gone because of 1,000 unspoken cuts. And your stillness is the silence of someone who counted everyone. They expected you to collapse. Instead, you built an empire from the ruins they left. They don't realize it right away. That's the cruelty of delayed consequence. At first, they feel relief. They think the silence means compliance. They think you're letting it go, that you're healing quietly in the corner, like a broken toy, waiting to be fixed. But what they don't see is the door locking behind you. What they don't hear is the version of you they once knew, being dismantled, piece by piece. And when they finally turn around, ready to resume the cycle, you're already gone. Not physically, energetically, spiritually. You don't hate them. You don't love them. You simply don't feel them anymore. And to someone addicted to your energy, that absence is a death sentence they never saw coming. They will feel it in phases. First confusion, then denial. Why did you change? They'll ask, as if you owe them a version of yourself they were careless with. They'll look for the cracks, test your patience again, try to resurrect the old dynamic through nostalgia and guilt. But your calm remains, not indifferent, not passive, decided. That's what they don't know how to face. The fact that the same eyes that once pleaded now simply observe. That the same hands that once reached now rest at your side. They will try to provoke you, not out of spite, but desperation. Because your silence says something their ego can't translate. I've already let you go. You just haven't realized it yet. You see, people rarely mourn the loss right away. They mourn the space you used to fill. And that grief grows in strange places. They'll hear a laugh that reminds them of yours and feel it like a bruise. They'll scroll past your photo and remember the way you looked at them before you knew, before you saw, before your intuition overpowered your affection. That's the part that torments them, the memory of your devotion, of how you loved them before you needed proof. They'll realize it in the silence between their distractions, in the pause after another shallow compliment, in the stillness of 3 a.m. when the bed is cold and the truth is louder than the noise they keep surrounding themselves with. Your absence doesn't scream. It whispers. It lingers. It reminds them of what they once had, but never protected. They'll try to replace you, not out of love, but out of habit, because your presence was a drug they didn't know they were addicted to. And now that it's gone, everything else tastes like ash. They'll chase echoes of you through people who don't speak your language. They'll mimic your cadence, your kindness, your insight. But copies never satisfy, and every failed connection becomes a mirror they cannot shatter. You stayed calm, and in that calmness, you cursed them with the one thing they never expected to face: themselves. You didn't walk away to teach them a lesson. You walked away because the lesson had already been learned by you. The calm wasn't for their punishment. It was for your peace. A sign that you no longer saw the point in convincing someone of your worth when they had already weighed it and dismissed it. You don't chase people who misplace value. You don't fight to remain in rooms that drain your soul. And you certainly don't waste breath trying to explain a wound to the one who inflicted it. That's where your power resides, not in retaliation, but in evolution. You stayed calm because your healing was not performative. It was precise. One day, they'll try to circle back, with half-hearted regret wrapped in flowery apology. They'll try to reclaim your forgiveness with old jokes and fabricated memories. But they'll meet someone who no longer bends, who no longer bleeds at their feet. And in that moment, it will hit them. The mistake they made was not in losing you. It was in thinking they could damage you and still keep access. But your calm was not an invitation to return. It was the locked gate, the final chapter, a story they'll reread in their mind until the words blur. You didn't yell. You didn't curse. You just ended. And that ending was more poetic than any punishment they could have imagined. Your sanity was never the problem. Their rules were you weren't crazy. You were confined, trapped inside a world designed to devour your clarity and then blame you for bleeding. They didn't want you stable. They wanted you obedient, quiet when they lied, soft when they struck, forgiving when they repeated the cycle. You mistook compromise for connection, thinking that if you bent just a little more, the storm would pass. But the storm wasn't circumstantial. It was structural. They built it that way. Chaos wasn't a byproduct. It was the rule book. A system of unspoken conditions built to dismantle your boundaries, one polite request at a time. And when you began to question those terms, when you dared to ask why the rules never applied to them, they didn't answer. They pointed at you and said, "Unstable." That's the sleight of hand. They couldn't discredit your truth, so they discredited your sanity. You adapted to survive. You taught yourself to read their energy before they entered the room. You edited your tone, shrank your voice, swallowed your instinct. Not because you didn't know better, but because you were made to feel that knowing better was dangerous. You called it love, They called it control. And the more you bent, the more praise you received, so long as you stayed inside the cage. But every time you tried to bring your full self to the table, they tilted it. Every boundary became a burden. Every question became an offense. Their rules were built like walls with no doors, just expectations and punishments. And still, you tried to play by them. Still, you tried to win a game where the goalposts moved every time you got close to joy. That wasn't madness. That was survival in a system designed to break you. They made sanity a moving target. One moment you were too emotional. The next you were too cold. Speak up, and you were aggressive. Stay silent, and you were withholding. You could never win, because they never intended for you to. They just needed to keep you guessing. The more you questioned yourself, the easier it was to control you. Your confusion became their playground, and they knew exactly which phrases to use, which buttons to press. Why are you making this a big deal? You're reading too much into it. You're always so intense. Subtle assassinations of the self, dressed in the language of reason. You weren't losing your mind. You were being cornered into silence. And that silence wasn't peace. It was erasure, a slow unraveling of your identity until you couldn't tell if you were the villain or the victim. But you started to notice the pattern. The way you felt lighter when they weren't around. The way your thoughts made more sense in solitude. The clarity that arrived once the noise stopped. That was your first sign. Sanity returning in their absence. Not as a roar, but as a whisper. A reminder that your mind was never the battlefield. It was the fortress they kept trying to invade. They told you that you were hard to love. But love was never their intent. It was obedience they craved. They didn't want your truth. They wanted your silence dressed as compassion. They didn't want your light. They wanted your dimness to reflect their comfort. Your sanity didn't break. It rebelled. It refused to follow rules that required you to die a little. You realized their rules only worked when you forgot your own. You never lost your mind. You lost their favor. The moment you stepped outside their maze, they called it madness. Because freedom looks unrecognizable to those addicted to cages. They said you were too much, because they built rules for smaller versions of you. Versions that didn't question. Versions that obeyed. Versions that flattered their ego at the expense of your authenticity. But the moment you started becoming whole, they labeled it insanity. That's how it works. In systems like theirs, healing is rebellion. Clarity is betrayal. You weren't unraveling. You were evolving. They just couldn't keep up. And instead of facing their own fragility, they weaponized your awakening and called it instability. They said you were difficult. But all you did was stop accepting distortion as truth. You stopped apologizing for your intuition. You stopped playing dumb to protect their comfort. That was never dysfunction. It was integrity. The kind that terrifies people who rely on lies. And once your eyes adjusted to the light, there was no returning to the dark. You saw the contradictions, the manipulations, the rewrites of reality. You saw the gaslighting for what it was. Not concern, but correction. Not love, but leverage. And when you spoke your truth with calm certainty, they couldn't argue with it. So they attacked the vessel. They tried to invalidate the source instead of confronting the substance. Because that's easier than admitting they broke what they couldn't control. Now they tell others you're unstable, that you changed suddenly, that you're on edge or acting different. And the truth is, you did change. You stopped playing the game. You burned their rulebook and started writing your own. One where your voice is not disruptive. One where your anger is sacred. One where your clarity is not something to be cured. And in that space, you finally found your sanity again, not as something broken, but as something stolen and returned. You don't need to convince anyone. You don't need to explain the peace that came when you reclaimed your perception. The people who get it, feel it. The ones who don't, were never meant to hold that version of you. You were always sane, always aware, always burning beneath the surface. You just had to survive long enough for the fire to become form, for your mind to reassemble its fragments without their fingerprints on it. You stayed quiet because their rules said that questioning was betrayal. But now you know, staying quiet is betrayal of self. You were never the problem. Your emotions weren't excessive. Your pain wasn't an overreaction. Your breakdowns weren't irrational. They were logical responses to a system built to consume you and then blame you for bleeding. Now you see. Now you know. And now, you write the rules. With clarity. With cold, beautiful precision. And you make no apologies for the mind they once tried to muffle. It was never broken. It was buried. And now, it reigns.